So in the 19th century then, you had these two personalities in Bombay, Hartman and Sir Bartle Frere, pushing for more British intervention in Eastern Africa. The drives they had were sort of anti-slavery, the spread of Christianity, and the increase of trade in the empire. One of the major problems was that, to a certain extent, both of these men were afraid of introducing initially an Indian workforce into East Africa of any sort. You have to remember that as subjects of the empire, Indians at that time that were under British rule were British subjects and were under the same laws and regulations as British subjects anywhere else in the world, more or less. The issue of who to take to East Africa and how to take them there was also under discussion. Things like indentured workers was something that was considered. But in the end, that was put on the side burner, and initially what they decided to do was to just take people as administrators and as people like surveyors to open up the country, and that's when the Goans first came in. Having surveyed the country and decided what was the best route, very often these routes were along the old slave routes used by the Arabs. The Europeans started to bring in the surveyors, and then they decided they needed the workforce to actually build the railways, and that's where they reinstated the idea of the indentured workers to East Africa, who worked on a fixed term and were kind of offered either the chance to stay for a certain number of years in East Africa or return. Now, in that first move, the biggest group of people to arrive were not Goans, and they were not the Parsis, but in their wake were the Punjabis, and particularly Punjabi Sikhs who were skilled metal workers, etc. So it brings in another dynamic group to East Africa. The majority of these, of course, were men. Large numbers of them died at the hands of man-eating lions, warriors who were very opposed to the arrival of the railway. The Maasais particularly, because one of the Maasai chiefs had a dream of this metal snake arriving in the country and his power being lost and the country being transformed. Mm-hmm. And as a result, there was a lot of opposition from such tribal groups. In other areas, bits of the line would be stolen. Metal was something that was quite rare in East Africa, although it did have an indigenous form of metalworking, and so it was easier to steal bits of wire from telegraph poles or from the railway bolts, etc., and of course not realizing that this actually made it very unsafe. And the terrain itself was very difficult to work with, and quite literally thousands of Punjabi workers died in East Africa and never returned to India. Many of those who did ended up returning with jiggers and various ailments that they'd contracted, malaria, jiggers, and loss of limbs, etc., that they'd contracted in East Africa. Once that was constructed, a third wave, if you like, of Asians arrived in East Africa and moved from the coast into the hinterland, and that includes the Gujarati traders. So they kind of moved into areas where other Asian groups like the Punjabi Sikhs and Goan traders were already establishing themselves, and together these three groups actually formed an interface of trade. They turned the barter system of African trading into a cash economy by actually bartering goods mainly from India at that time in exchange for basic raw materials and foods, etc., hides, ivory, and then they would sell these products to Europeans or European firms for export, and therefore the cash economy had sort of begun to transform the economy of East Africa.